In 1982, the radical left wing of the British Labour Party was elected as the leader of the London municipal government, the Greater London Council. And one of their major policy goals was to try to achieve pay equity amongst the state workers, of which they would soon become the employer. The senior civil servants said that this was an important endeavor, and given its importance, that it would be good if the GLC created a department dedicated especially to that, a new women's department. And it took a while for the members of the GLC to realize that all of the powers in the personnel department, and this was actually a way of being a hindrance to the implementation of the pay equity policy, not a way of expediting it. And I think that this is a good example of the difference between taking office and taking power. And this is something that we really have to consider if the goal of taking office in the first place is then to take power in order to redistribute it. And taking power forces us to consider a project not only of democratizing governance, but also of administration. And so today I want to talk about projects for democratic administration as an alternative to the Keynesian welfare state and the neoliberal new public management, and talk a little bit about the role of public sector workers in projects for democratic administration. One of the things I'd like to do is to try to formalize this idea of democratic administration by giving a bit of a framework. And to begin, I think that generally these projects include three major groups as part of a kind of counter block of organizations. And these include civil society organizations, those dedicated to some kind of egalitarianism or democratization of various realms of society, public sector workers, and then sympathetic governments like, for example, the GLC. So if those are the three groups involved, I want to argue that generally, when people have discussed democratic administration, they have been talking about a variety of activities that I think we could distinguish into three main strategies. And I'm going to argue that these three main strategies are interdependent, that for democratic administration to be successful, each side requires the other two, or else the triangle, as pictured here, will collapse. And so the first strategy, I think we could describe as a kind of public-public partnership, in contrast to the public-private partnerships that are typical of neoliberalism. And this primarily, at least from the outset, is a relationship between egalitarian civil society organizations and public sector workers, namely the providers and the users of public services. And the goal is to try to create a deeper integration of efforts, coalitions, alliances, and the like, in order to try to defend, expand, and improve the quality of public services. And that includes increasing the extent to which users can participate in the formulation of policy around the provision of public services. This might include, for example, public sector unions putting improving the quality of public services as their main demand on the bargaining table when they're engaged in collective bargaining. I think a pretty good model of this that we've seen recently is the community unionism of the Chicago Teachers Union and the way in which they have engaged in these kinds of coalitional efforts with parents and students. Now, of course, to be really effective, this can't just be a relationship between civil society organizations and public sector workers. Government would have to get involved too, but this is where I think it starts. The second strategy is something that has come to be known as popular planning, and this primarily is a relationship between civil society organizations, in potential or actual, and sympathetic governments that are trying to increase the extent to which there is popular deliberation over and participation in policy. And not just at the end after policies have already been formulated and are at the implementation phase, but really an attempt to increase points of access for popular participation at every point of the policymaking process, from the very beginning at policy identification and formulation. And I I think a pretty good example of this might be something like participatory budgeting, something that we've seen, for example, in Brazil. The third major strategy, I think we can describe, for lack of a better term, as state workers control. And it begins primarily as a relationship between government and state workers or public sector workers. And the idea here is to try to flatten the administrative or bureaucratic hierarchies that exist by restructuring them in ways that would give more workers' control, autonomy, and discretion to state workers, in particular those on the front line. And there are a number of reasons for doing this. The first one is that the sort of command and control structure of the bureaucratic hierarchy is one of the means by which senior civil servants, senior officials have the kind of power that they have, a power that is not merely administrative, but can be political, whatever the pretense of neutrality there might be. And I think the example I opened with at the outset of the GLC and the way in which their pay equity policy was subverted by senior civil servants acting very politically, I think that's a pretty good example of that. So trying to flatten the administrative hierarchy might be a way to try to erode some of that power that exists amongst senior officials at the apex. Another thing is that the sort of command and control structure and the rigid departmental boundaries actually impede the quality of services. They establish these kinds of barriers between realms of social life that don't exist in actuality, and they make it more difficult for the providers of public services to do things like, sometimes it's called stepping outside the brief. That, if their main issue is health, and they realize that there are serious health issues amongst a particular constituency, and that this is the result of a number of factories in that community, even if this takes them into the realm of labor and the like, that they shouldn't have to cross this immense hierarchical and administrative boundary in order to make the connections between these two fundamentally connected issues. And so generally the idea, to summarize, is the attempt to increase the autonomy and power that state workers have over how the public services are being provided, the best way to provide them. Often they have the best idea of what would be the best way to provide these services to the communities with which they are most familiar. I'm reminded, I was part of a transit group that was trying to improve the bus line in a working class neighborhood. And speaking to some of the bus drivers, they told me that the route schedules had been planned by someone who drove around in a car, not a bus. And that wreaked havoc. This is an indication of some of the inefficiencies that arise as a result of these hierarchies. Okay, so if those are the three major strategies and the three major groups within this broader framework of democratic administration, I think it's important to emphasize their necessary interdependence. For example, if you're going to flatten administrative hierarchies and give state workers more autonomy and workers' control over their working conditions, we also have to note the potential dangers of that. It's not only a matter of, say, teachers who know how best to meet the needs of, say, the racialized community where they are providing education. It might also be the police officer who alters statistical reports to buffer themselves from accountability. That's another example of potential discretion and the abuse of discretion on the front lines. And so any attempt to do a kind of state workers control strategy, I think, would need the other two aspects of democratic administration, like public-public partnerships to increase the public oversight, the oversight that service users provide on public sector workers. And in the absence or where there's weakness in these kinds of coalitional efforts, popular planning can provide funding and institutional resources to marginalized groups to facilitate their self-organizing projects as a way to start to increase the extent to which they can provide oversight over the provision of services. So the interdependence is key. However, I think the experience of attempts to engage in projects of democratic administration have tended to confront as its biggest barrier one of these strategies in particular, and that has to do with state workers' control. One of the major problems of democratic administration is that a lot of the people committed to it have spent their adult lives defending the interests of workers and railing against employers. And then if they win an election, they take office, suddenly they find themselves in the uncomfortable situation of being the boss of state workers, and not just the boss, but sometimes the largest employer in the city or the region or even the country. And the attempts to try to restructure bureaucratic hierarchies to increase state workers' control in the few cases where they have been attempted, because largely they have not even been tried by radical left governments, socialist governments, and the like, have come up against a number of obstacles. Number one, senior civil servants have been opposed to the restructuring of the administrative hierarchy because it would start to challenge their own sources of power within that bureaucracy. Some of the senior members of public sector unions have often resisted attempts, as they did in the case of the GLC, for largely the same reason, especially in the ways in which these unions can start to mirror the hierarchy of the departments for which they work. And there's also been resistance sometimes from the rank and file of public sector unions because they have experience of pseudo participation schemes where contributions of their knowledge from the front lines have been used against them as a way to try to engage in de-skilling. And so they too might be opposed initially to efforts to increase their participation and discretion on the front lines. And so in conclusion, I think that any any attempt to try to not only democratize government but also administration, any attempt to engage in this broader project of democratic administration has to keep these things in mind and has to start thinking through the idea of left forms of management, given that they will become employers. What would a democratic management look like? Because if they wait until taking office to start to work through some of these issues, they will never get to the point of taking power, and therefore they will be unable to redistribute that power, which after all is the whole point of trying to democratize governance and administration. So I will leave it there. Thank you.